Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guest, Dr. Glenn Livingston. And he's here today to share with us his new book, Never Binge Again. Now, Glenn is a veteran psychologist and was a longtime CEO of a multi-million-dollar consulting firm which has serviced several Fortune 500 clients in the food industry. You may have seen his previous work, theories, and research in major outlets like the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Indiana Star-Ledger, and the New York Daily News, among many other media. So let's welcome to the show Dr. Glenn Livingston.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. How are you?
What? Oh, fabulous. And I'm so glad we're going to be talking about your book. I mean, this is a game changer.
It was a game changer for me, and it was a very private thing. I never really intended to publish it. So I'm just honored and delighted that we've got 600,000 readers and 1,800 reviews, and we're helping people all around the world. It's a blessing in my life.
Oh, well, yeah, and for our listeners that are new to your story, why don't you share with us the inspiration behind writing this book?
Inspiration was a lot of pain. A lot of pain and suffering. I had a problem. I'm a psychologist, but that doesn't automatically mean that everything in your life is rosy. And I'm from a family of 17 psychotherapists and counselors and social workers and everything. And when I was a kid, somewhere around 16, 17 years old, I was always weird with food, but I discovered something which at the time seemed like a superpower, but it wasn't. What seemed like a superpower was that because I'm 6'4" and fairly muscular, that if I worked out for 2.5, 3 hours a day, I could eat whatever I wanted to. So I was no stranger to eating boxes of donuts or whole pizzas or boxes of chocolate bars or big giant boxes of cereal. I really could down 6, 7, 8,000 calories a day, no problem. And I enjoyed it. I spent an awful lot of time working out and an awful lot of time eating, but when you're 17, other than girls and playing in a rock band, that's really what was occupying my time. And right when I got a little older, when I was 22, 23 years old, I was married, and I was commuting 2 hours each way to graduate school, and I was seeing patients, and I had all these responsibilities, and I just couldn't keep up with the workouts. If I could work out twice a week for half an hour, I was lucky. And unfortunately, I discovered that the food seemed to have a life of its own, and I couldn't stop. So I was still eating 6,000 to 8,000 calories a day, maybe a little less, but I was not working out. And also my metabolism was slowing down a little bit, and I started to gain weight. And my triglycerides went through the roof. The doctors were telling me I was going to die in my 30s if I didn't do something about it. It was about 10 times what they should be. And worse than all that, I couldn't be a good psychologist. I mean, I work with suicidal people, and I never lost anybody, so I guess I was okay. But I couldn't be 100% present. When you work with someone in a high-risk situation like that, really it should be every situation, but especially a high-risk situation like that, it's not really an intellectual endeavor. You have to be present. You have to lend people your soul. But I was thinking, when can I get to the deli and dislodge my jaw to empty the contents of the tray into my mouth? And I was just constantly thinking about the next meal. And so that bothered me more than anything else, believe it or not, because it made me a worse psychologist than I wanted to be. So I went through everything you think a psychologist might go through to try to recover from this, because I made the assumption that I probably have a hole in my heart. There's something really hurting me, and I must be eating to escape from that. And if I could figure out what that was, then I'd be better. And I went to all the best psychologists. I went to eating disorder specialists. I went to nutritionists. I grew up in and around New York, and given the family I was from, I knew all these people really well. And I went to Overeaters Anonymous. I took medication for a little while. Everything helped a little bit until it didn't. And then I got much worse. And I just kept gaining weight. So I'd be thin for a little while, and then I would bounce all the way back. And eventually, I never had children. I always worked at home, and I had a lot of time in my hands for a second career. So in addition to my clinical practice, I specialized in children and families, and wound up seeing a lot of people after a divorce, and that's where I ran into suicidal people or on the verge of divorce after an affair. I also was consulting for industry. I was doing millions of dollars of advertising research for big food companies and big pharmaceutical companies and a bunch of other Fortune 500 companies. And they were giving me a lot of money to do this kind of stuff, and I thought, wow, these studies really must be worth something. So eventually I said, I'm going to do a study for myself. And I actually funded my own study with 40,000 people over the course of about 5 years, back in the days when internet clicks were very cheap. And I managed to figure out 3 significant associations. And I'll tell you up front that as interesting as these are, they led me astray, and they actually made the problem worse. So I don't want people to get the wrong idea from what I'm going to say. But what I found out was that people who struggled with chocolate, I always tended to start my binges with chocolate, and people like me tended to be lonely or brokenhearted. People who struggled with crunchy, salty things like pretzels and chips, they tended to be stressed at work. And people who struggled with chewy, soft things like bagels and bread and pasta, pizza, they tended to be stressed at home. And I thought that was really interesting. But before I went to work on that with my clients, and at the time I was mostly referring people with eating disorders out because I felt like it wasn't ethical. I had one myself. What I did was I went and I talked to my mom about it because she was also a therapist, and she brought me up, and I figured if anybody would know what happened, it would be her. And this really interesting talk with her. I said, Mom, I'm in a bad marriage, so of course I'm a little lonely or brokenhearted, and I don't know what I'm going to do about that, but can you tell me in my upbringing what would have made this association between chocolate and feeling lonely or upset or interpersonally, dissatisfied? And Mom gets this horrible look on her face and this awful sound in her voice, and she says, oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Okay, Mom, what is it? She goes, I'm so sorry. I said, Mom, what is it? She says, well, when you were about a year old, your grandfather, my father, he just got out of prison. And I adored this man. He was my salvation in life. And I didn't know he was doing these things, and he was guilty. And my whole world came apart. And I was very, very depressed, kind of staring at the wall a lot of the time. At the same time, your father, my husband, this was 1965, he was a captain in the Army, and they were talking about sending him to Vietnam. And I was terrified I was going to be a single mother, and we had another one on the way. And I was terrified I was going to lose him, and you were going to lose your dad. So I didn't have the wherewithal to hold you and love you and feed you the right things when you came running to me crying. So what I did is I put a little refrigerator on the floor, and I always kept a bottle of Bosco chocolate syrup in the refrigerator. And whenever you came running to me, I'd say, honey, go get your Bosco. And I point over to the refrigerator, and you'd crawl over there, and you'd open it up, and you'd open the bottle, and you'd suck on it, and you'd go into a chocolate sugar coma. And I said, oh, my God. I mean, if this was the movies, then Mom and I would have a great big hug and a big cry. I would forgive each other, and I would never have trouble with chocolate again. But, it's not the movies. Although we did hug, we did forgive each other, and we did cry a little bit. And it was a valuable conversation to have from an interpersonal perspective. I found that I certainly was more forgiving of my mom, but I was also more forgiving of myself. I was softer on myself about everything that had happened, and I realized why I had the problem. But the problem actually got worse. And the reason it got worse was I discovered there was this crazy little voice in my head, and it went something like this. Hey, Glenn, do you know what? You're right. Your mama didn't love you enough, and she left a great big chocolate-sized hole in our heart. And until you can find the love of your life and get out of this marriage, we're going to have to go right on binging. Yippee, let's go get some right now. And I discovered there was this voice of justification. And I realized that I was going at things from the wrong paradigm. I was assuming that I had to love myself thin. I was assuming that I had to cure all this emotional upset before I would stop eating. Like, it's not what I'm eating, it's what's eating me. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time that I had an inkling that maybe the problem was that there was a voice inside me that was just rationalizing and making it okay. So if you think of the emotions as a fire in a fireplace, this voice of justification was poking holes in the fireplace. And maybe the fire was perfectly okay to have if the fireplace contained it well enough. And I suddenly said, let me start to work with this voice of justification. Let me see what I can do with that. And I kept a journal for about 8 years. I started studying a lot of alternative addiction literature. Came across a guy named Jack Trempe from Rational Recovery who basically taught me a different paradigm. He pointed out that the seat of food addiction was the reptilian brain, the brainstem, the most primitive part of our brain, and that the human parts of our brain were actually superior to the primitive part of our brain. And that while now these are my words, not his, and this comes from some of my research into neurology and a lot of the exposure that I had to what the big companies were doing from the inside. But basically, when your reptilian brain looks at something in the environment, it says, do I eat it, do I mate with it, or do I kill it? Eat, mate, or kill. Love is notably absent from the reptilian brain. It was millions of years later that the mammalian brain evolved to inhibit the reptilian brain to say, now wait a minute, before you eat, mate, or kill that thing, what impact is this going to have on the people that you love and your tribe? And then the neocortex, what we think of as more of the human brain, evolved millions of years later to say, okay, in addition to that, how is this going to affect our long-term goals? What impact is it going to have on the kind of person we want to see ourselves as, the contribution we make to society? What about religion and spirituality and creativity and music and art and cooperation with others towards long-term projects? What about all that? And each layer of the brain is really superior to the other layers of the brain, such that we really do have the ability to resist virtually any impulse. And so this whole notion that we were powerless over food, or that we had to have accountability partners, or that there was really no human defense against certain impulses, it's just wrong. It's just not how our neurology is set up. And this whole notion that we have to love ourselves more, it's a nice notion. We do need to love ourselves more. I'm in favor of nurturing your inner wounded child, but I don't think it's going to do you any good for your food addiction. I don't think it's going to do you any good for any addiction, to tell you the truth. So this is the embarrassing part, Marianne. I really thought this was going to be private. And what I did next is not something that a sophisticated psychologist who's done tens of millions of dollars of consulting would ever do. And I never thought I'd admit it in public. But I started keeping a journal, and I decided that I was going to call my reptilian brain my inner pig, or just my pig for short. Mm-hmm. And I decided I would draw very bright lines between healthy eating and unhealthy eating. So, for example, I would say, I'll only ever eat chocolate on the last Saturday of the calendar month. Very, very clear rule, so I wouldn't have to make any decisions. And that way I would know that if I heard a little voice in my head, that voice of justification we talked about, that said, hey, Glenn, you've worked out hard enough and it's not going to do any damage. You can get away with a little chocolate binge right now. Yippee, let's go get some. I would know that was my pig squealing, and I would say the chocolate itself was pig slop. And when I heard that, I'd say, well, I don't need pig slop, but I don't let farm animals tell me what to do. And as crazy as that sounds, as primitive as it sounds, it would wake me up at the moment of impulse and give me those extra seconds to make a choice. And it wasn't a miracle. I mean, in some ways it was, because it took away that feeling of powerlessness and hopelessness, and it really turned the ship around. But I don't mean to give people the impression that, all of a sudden everything was all well. I would still make mistakes sometimes, but I lost the I regained the sense that I had control. I regained the sense that I could make decisions about this. And I realized that I could make whatever rules that I wanted to. I wasn't letting anybody else tell me what to eat or what not to eat. And so it was really just a matter of figuring out which pig squeals I was having trouble ignoring, which pig squeals were more convincing to me. For example, one of them is the idea that you can start tomorrow and it won't make a difference. But if you look more deeply into the research on neurology, if you have chocolate in response to a chocolate urge today, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with chocolate, but if you're trying to give it up, if you eat it today, it's going to be much harder for you to give it up tomorrow because you will have strengthened that neurological pathway. What fires together wires together is the shorthand term in neuroplasticity research. But I would keep a journal, and I keep a journal of all the squeals, and I did it for 8 years, and I made all these different rules, and eventually they got a little simpler. I realized there were different categories, and before you knew it, I was thin again. And more importantly, when I got the rules right for me, and everybody really has to come up with their own set, but when I got them right for me, the miraculous part was really that crazy voice in my head disappeared. I wasn't spending all this time obsessing about, okay, if I do eat it, how much am I going to eat? How am I going to stop myself from it? How am I going to recover from it? Am I going to have to eat less tomorrow? Am I going to have to do more exercise? How am I going to hide the evidence from my wife? All that obsession, it just went away, and it was replaced by a presence of mind, which doesn't mean that I'm always happy. Life is not always wonderful. I mean, life is pretty miserable sometimes, some of the things that have happened, but life on life's terms is much better than life on the terms of food addiction. So that's my story in a nutshell. I think the other piece of it that really helped me was the understanding of what was going on in the food industry and how they were engineering these hyper-palatable food-like substances, concentrations of sugar and fat and starch and oil and excitotoxins and salt that are meant to press your bliss buttons without giving you enough nutrition to make you feel satisfied. And if you looked at the animal studies and what happens when you short-circuit the pleasure mechanism in the brain, I'm not saying people are putting electrodes in our brains, but if you do that, and we're pretty close when you walk out of a McDonald's and there's a Burger King across the street, right? You can do that in most cities today. When you short-circuit the pleasure mechanism, if you put an electrode in an animal's brain in the pleasure center and you let them press a button to self-stimulate, they will ignore their survival needs to press that button thousands of times a day. A starving rat just press the button thousands of times a day and ignore its food. A nursing mother rat will press the button thousands of times a day. It's a hijacking of the survival drive. And what I think is happening in society is that the industry has gotten so good at hijacking our survival drive that people don't like fruit and vegetables anymore. They're ignoring what they really need to survive. They feel like they can never lose weight because, to lose weight, everybody knows you have to eat a lot more fruit and vegetables. And we're all looking for love at the bottom of a bag or a box or a container. So that's my story. I'm a thin guy now for many years. I'm very healthy. I published the book on a whim. I was a minor partner in a publishing company, and the CEO asked if I could write a book, and I was going through a divorce, and I needed something to do because I was closing everything else down. And I said, okay, let's see what happens. So I took the journal and I turned it into a book, and it just took off. So that's why I get up on stage and say, yeah, I'm a psychologist, but I've got this pig inside me. And if you're willing to have a pig inside you, then I can help you too. So that's my story.
It really breaks it down so people can easily understand what is going on. I mean, you've done so much research. You've walked the walk. You've gone through everything, done everything, and really kind of gotten to the point where you scienced out what works.
It works for me, and it works for a whole lot of people that feel like nothing else is working for them. It tends to work for people who don't mind rules. Like if you like to study in school and you like the kind of structured approach and you like distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy food, then it tends to work. If you're someone who feels like you should be able to have everything in moderation and just kind of eat through your intuition, that doesn't always work. That doesn't always work with this approach. But it does resonate with an awful lot of people, and there are a lot of people writing in saying that they lost hundreds of pounds, actually. So,
well, it's very encouraging to hear that.
Yeah.
To hear that what you've worked on for so long and journaled about has really brought some, really kind of peace to a lot of people, because, the emotional, when we talk about binging, there's so much emotion that goes behind all of that.
The relationship between emotions and binging is really interesting, because you could look at the foods that you're eating, like with me with chocolate, and you could trace it back to a pattern. And it's always very intriguing to figure out what happened in your life that caused you to associate that with binging. Like, why do you run for? We call it comfort. It's misleading, and it's actually a little dangerous to just call it comfort food, because while the body does have a reduced capacity to process the emotions when all that energy is diverted to your digestive system, so you feel a kind of anesthetic effect. You feel numbed out a little bit or sometimes a lot, and you can't really concentrate on your emotions or feel your emotions when you're overeating. What the idea that you're eating just for comfort ignores is the fact that you're actually eating things which are getting you high. They're legal, and there's not going to be a donut bust anytime soon. No one's going to come barging into your house and take all those bagels away from you and put you in jail. But these are things that didn't exist in the tropics, that didn't exist in the savannah as we were evolving. So, and they do produce this concentrated form of pleasure that we weren't prepared for. It's a high. You have concentrated sugar, you feel a high that we weren't really meant to feel for about 18 minutes, and then you start to crash unless you chase it with more sugar. So I prefer that people reframe the idea that binging is an emotional activity to the idea that binging is an addicted activity. It's an effort to get high with food. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, because it's another. It is that addictive activity that there's something, as you're saying, there's something to it, and it has to be investigated a little bit more. And it kind of has me wondering, if someone does go back and tries to find where's the root of this, and they're unable to, what do they do then?
Well, I recommend that you stop binging before you figure out where the root is. And there are some things you might never know. So it so happens that I discovered this by exhausting all of the emotional roots first. But I could have just said chocolate and anything other than the last Saturday of the calendar month is pig slop to me, and I never eat pig slop, and I don't let farm animals tell me what to do. I could have done that initially and never known why I ran to chocolate. And maybe I'd always be curious, but I wouldn't be binging. So what I recommend is that you focus on the practical behaviors. You step back and say, where's my most dangerous trouble food or behavior, and what role do I want that to play in my life from now on? And what kind of person do I want to become around that trouble food or behavior? See, if I say I only eat chocolate on the last Saturday of the calendar month, what I'm really saying is I've chosen to become the kind of person who only eats chocolate one day per month. That's the kind of person that I'm going to think of myself as from now on. And it's an important distinction, because with one of them you feel like you're following these Nazi-like rules imposed from the outside, even though you're making them. With the other one, you're making a decision to become a different kind of character. And character trumps willpower on every level. See, willpower is a fatigable muscle. It's not like an on-off switch or something that people are genetically gifted with. It's more like gas in the tank, and what burns that gas is decision-making of all types, especially about food, but decision-making of all types. And what prevents you from having to make a decision is your character commitments. I'll give you an example outside of the food realm that should make this really clear. Although it's a little in the food realm. Suppose you walk into a diner and you sit down at the counter and there's a fresh, crisp $10 bill on the table because the waitress hasn't seen her tip yet from the last customer. And she says, "Hey, I'll be right back. I just have to get you a menu." And there are no video cameras. There's no window. Nobody's up front. Nobody would see you take that. Virtually nobody that I put in that situation and ask if they would take it says that they would. And I'll say, "Why?" And they'll say, "Well, that woman worked really hard for their money." I say, "So why won't you take it?" They'll say, "Well, I'm not a thief." And I say, "Oh, so as a matter of character, because of the way that you define yourself, you don't even have to make a decision about whether to take the $10 bill or not. It's just out of the question. It's inconsistent with who you are. You're not a thief. You have an unwritten rule that says, I never steal. Under any circumstances, I just never steal." And they'll go, "Oh, I see what you're saying. Why can't you do that with food? Why can't you decide the kind of person you want to be around chocolate, around chips?" It doesn't have to be a restriction. It can be something that encourages mindfulness or a behavior. Like I always put my fork down between bites. I'm the kind of person that eats mindfully and slowly. I always put my fork down between bites. Or I never go back for seconds. I'm the kind of person who doesn't go back for seconds. You take some time, and in the beginning, it's a bit of work, kind of like learning how to drive is a bit of work. You have to learn the rules of the road. But once you know the rules of the road, it's really not a problem anymore. You just do it as second nature. So I forgot a little bit how I got to this, but I was trying to illustrate the point that character trumps willpower. And although this might seem a little bit odd, all you're really doing is adding more character rules, but you're doing it consciously and purposely as opposed to being acculturated to do it. Because there are all these character rules that we, in our culture, take for granted. We don't even know that we learned them. Like, I never just run up to attractive women in the street and kiss them. I never pee in my mother-in-law's living room. I don't kick policemen in the tush. These are all the types of people we've decided to be because we want to be normal, law-abiding citizens. But still, they are impulses that at one point had to be overcome from strong biological urges. And we subjugated those impulses to our will and decided that we would just become different kind of people so we could participate in society. So what I've really discovered is nothing more than common sense. I don't claim to have invented anything. I think I'm a very good narrator. I think I've got a very good story to bring this to light. I think that I've discovered a lot of nuances about how to coach people through this effectively, but really, I'm just clearing away the myths in our culture, the idea that you have to love yourself thin, the idea that addiction is a disease, the idea that, or even the idea that advertising doesn't work. People don't realize that there are billions of dollars that go into getting them to eat from these bags and boxes and containers. And I just try to help people figure out, well, who do they want to be around which particular foods, in what quantities, and how do you stick to that as a matter of character.
Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Dr. Glenn Livingston in regards to his new book, Never Binge Again. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 123 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
There are nearly 2 million Americans living with amputation. Many live right here in San Antonio. Becoming an amputee can be scary, frustrating, isolating, but there's no reason to feel alone. The San Antonio Amputee Foundation is here to help support you and guide you toward resources such as home and car modifications and even prosthetic limbs. For more information or to make a donation, visit saamputee.org. We'll help you live a full, active life, one step at a time. San Antonio Amputee Foundation, healing limbs, hearts, and souls.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with special guest, Dr. Glenn Livingston, and he's sharing with us his new book, Never Binge Again. Now, Glenn, before we went for break, we were talking about analogies. And I know you have one in your book that talks about how it's the bank robbing analogy. Basically, you know, every time we pass a bank, we don't have this overwhelming urge to rob it. And I loved how you use that analogy with food in regards to how we feel about ourselves and food and our willpower.
Marianne, it's a biological urge. The urge to binge is a biological urge. It's a stimulation of the fight or flight response. It's a perceived emergency, as if we are in a famine state and need to hoard up on calories. It's a perceived biological urge. It's really an error, but it's nothing more than an organ in your body saying, you know, you have to eat this to survive. And it's been corrupted by profiteers in industry. Every time you go for that bag, box, or container, there's some guy, big fat guy in a white suit with a mustache that's laughing all the way to the bank. I'm just using that as an iconic image for you to remember and hopefully wake up the next time that you're thinking about that. But it's no more of a deal to figure out how to control this than it was to learn how to control your bladder. Your bladder generates very powerful biological urges, but you decide where and when and how and in what places that biological urge can be expressed. And if you don't, you can't participate in society in the way that you really want to. So it's just another task like learning how to control another biological organ. And what you want to do, rather than making this such a complex thing, after you've made it really clear what being healthy and unhealthy means to you, where the line is when you hear that voice in your head that tries to justify crossing the line, think of it like a wolf challenging the alpha leader in the pack for leadership. And when the alpha wolf is challenged for leadership, it doesn't say, oh my goodness, someone needs a hug. Someone's feeling feeling sad or lonely or, needs a little love, that alpha wolf looks at the challenger and snarls and shows its teeth and says, "Get back in line or I'll kill you." Like the alpha wolf has the intent to kill any challenger because it's proving that it's superior at all costs. And you are superior to these urges at all costs, no matter what you believe, no matter what the food industry has you believing, no matter what the advertising industry has you believing, no matter how much every bone in your body feels like you have to have those chips or those bars or whatever your particular poison is, you can actually make a choice. The other piece of this is that there are some rules that you couldn't follow. Like I couldn't make a rule that said I will never pee again. Because if I made a rule that said I would never pee again, my bladder would show me differently after some time. I might be able to go 12 hours. Actually, at my age, it's probably more like 5. But I can't make a rule that contradicts my biological necessities. So the other half of this is you don't want to just make rules that restrict you. You need to be sure that you are properly nourishing yourself in a reliable, sustainable way. If you're really having trouble with overeating binges, then I recommend that you stay away from a lot of the fasting routines that are in vogue. I'm not saying there aren't medical benefits to that, but it seems to me that for binge eaters, for people that really get out of control with their eating, you want to have a regular, reliable source of nutrition and calories available at all times, 3 times a day, spread out in regular intervals, so that your body doesn't perceive itself to be going into a famine at any point. Because when you do, it only makes sense that evolution would say, hey, if we live in an environment where food is sometimes very scarce, then as soon as it's available, we'd better hoard it. So for people who are really enamored with fasting or intermittent fasting, I ask them to put that off for 6 months or a year and get the binging under control first. And then we can talk about having longer periods of not eating and shorter windows and things like that.
What are some of the ways that you suggest that people work through their discomfort of the food cravings? And we've talked about a few different things here.
Well, first of all, recognize that a craving is a wonderful thing. It's not a sign of illness. It's not a sign that there's something wrong with you. It's a sign that you have a healthy appetite. It's just directed in the wrong direction. And it's probably been done so for someone else's benefit. So you can get mad about that rather than feeling ashamed or, upset about it. You get mad about that. You can also tell yourself that the only way to get rid of cravings is to have cravings. You have to experience the craving and not indulge it in order to teach your brain to dissociate that craving from any kind of reward. And then you need to find what authentic need was underneath that craving. So for me, you're not supposed to believe me. You're supposed to just try it. For me, when I got off chocolate, and I eventually decided not to have chocolate at all, every time I had a craving, I say, okay, great. I'm experiencing this craving. That's a chance to extinguish it somewhat. I would tell my pig that I was glad that it was suffering with the craving, that it made me suffer a lot over the years, with all the after effects of eating 6 to 10 chocolate bars. So I'm glad that it was going to suffer now, and this was my opportunity to make it suffer, so I would enjoy that. I would take some deep breaths and tense all my muscles and then let it all go because I wanted to take myself out of the state of emergency that is perceived when you enter that, feast or famine, fight or flight response. Because all of these things counter the brain's tendency to say you have to do this now. You should be less discriminating and forget all your rules. You have to do this now. And I'd say this is an opportunity to extinguish the craving. Feelings aren't facts. It might feel like I have to have this, but I don't. And then I would go and I would have some type of nutritional drink. Turned out for me, the thing that worked best was kale juice and bananas. If I had a real chocolate craving, I'd have 5 or 6 ripe bananas with 2 heads of kale, either juiced or at least I'd remove the stems and put them in a big Vitamix. And I would drink that all down. And I wasn't satisfied or high in the way that I would have been high if I had the chocolate bars, but the craving went away. And before I knew it, I was craving those banana and kale juice smoothies instead of the chocolate bars. So you need to figure out what the authentic need is underneath the particular cravings. When you're craving salt, often I find that people are having a craving for some type of greens, or it's really a mineral craving. So greens or maybe a little bit of seaweed will solve that. I'm not a nutritionist. These are just things that I've happened upon. And so, yeah, you deal with the craving by welcoming it, by saying feelings aren't facts, by saying your pig has the craving that you don't, that it's fun to make your pig suffer after all the years it made you suffer, that you're not going to indulge it because it's your opportunity to extinguish it, and enjoying your hunger. Sometimes, I don't have much to grab anymore, but when I was a little bit overweight, I would grab my stomach at those times and I'd go, let it burn, baby, let it burn. Just to remind myself and my pig that I didn't really need any calories. I had them right there.
Well, and you've given so many great tips and tools, and I think using the inner pig and talking that way really helps reframe how people, when they're in this position and they're hearing this voice going, well, you can have some more chocolate or ice cream or French fries or whatever the thing is, it's a good way of reframing it. So it's like, who wants to eat from a pig trough? No one does,
Exactly. And telling yourself that you're getting high with food as opposed to comforting yourself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you really kind of putting it back to basics. And it's interesting when people do that, they probably are finding out that they like fruits and vegetables more than they thought they did.
Yes. Well, but you want it first. There's a phenomenon called downregulation. And what that means is when a supersized stimulus is presented to your nervous system repeatedly, your nervous system downregulates its response. It becomes less responsive because it has to. It's like when I first went to graduate school, I lived in Queens underneath the subway. And I couldn't imagine how I was possibly going to sleep the first week that I was there. But 2 weeks later, I could barely hear the subway. My nervous system had downregulated to that supersized stimulus in the environment because there was nothing of import in that information. And that noise was always there, so it didn't make sense for my brain to keep paying so much attention to it. The same thing happens with your taste bud. If you present, a chocolate bar has a higher concentration of sugar and fat and caffeine and theobromine and a lot of the things you'd find in nature, that it got a supersized presentation of that. And so what happens is your taste buds downregulate and the pleasure systems in your brain downregulate also, so that you need more and more chocolate to feel the same amount of pleasure. At some point, people get to the point where they feel like they need that substance just to feel normal. But they don't really get pleasure out of it anymore, but they don't feel normal without it. So when you first start shifting back over towards fruits and vegetables and whole natural foods, you're not going to enjoy them in the way that nature intended you to enjoy them. The good news is there's also a phenomenon of upregulation. If I move to the country and I sleep in the country every day for a month, and then I went back to listen to the subway, it would suddenly sound very loud to me again. Whereas by the end of the month in the country, I could really hear the crickets, and I could hear I could hear someone's voice from all the way across the room. I just become that much more sensitive. So your brain regulates up and down, and it takes a while before that happens. Not as long as you think. It's really a matter of, 1 or 2 months. But initially, an apple is not going to taste that sweet to you. That's okay. Feelings aren't facts. The sweetness is still there. So go through the motions, make it happen, and before you know it, you're going to enjoy it a lot more than you think you will.
Well, and kind of on that point, how important is it to stay hydrated through this process as well?
I think it's exceptionally important. I think that our brain can confuse thirst with hunger. And very often if you're experiencing a craving for something, often something salty, but also really just about any craving, you can sometimes get rid of that craving by having a whole bunch of water.
Mm-hmm.
I have a big jug of fresh squeezed orange juice on my desk. I think I'm going to have a sip now, actually.
You're motivating people with drinking fresh juice. Hey, that's a great thing. I like drinking fresh juice too because I have a juicer here at home, and I actually use it quite often. Although it does sound like a wood chipper when I get it going. So, but it's nice to be able to do that. One of the things you talk about in your book, because I think I have time for a few more questions here, you talk about unconscious binging. What is that?
Well, it's a myth, really. People have the belief that they're not there when they're binging. They'll say they just went numb and they went into autopilot. But if I ask them to reconstruct the binge for me, they can tell me. It's like there was a video camera running the whole time. They just weren't paying attention to it. And it's important to disallow the idea that your pig could knock you out and unconsciously binge, because you'll use that as your pig will use that as an excuse to eat anything that it wants to all the time. And for example, I remember a woman who she binged on some lemon cake at the office at a party, and she said she just went unconscious and she did it. I said, well, what were you doing before you did that? And she said, well, I was on Facebook and I was looking at these cute cats that my friend Elaine sent me. And I'm saying, how long have you known Elaine? Oh, a long time. And what color was the cat? And she said it was a red tabby. And what did you do with that video? Did you send it to anyone else? She said, yeah, I shared it on my timeline. And then what happened? Well, Phyllis came by and she was carrying a cake and going to the lunchroom. And I remember getting curious, so I walked over to see when the party was, and she told me. And then what happened? Well, I went back to work and I worked on my report and I shared it with Phil and he was happy with it. Made a couple of the changes. And then I knew it was about time for lunch, and so I walked over to see if the party was going on. And I actually wasn't going to have a lemon cake then, but it was sitting on the table, and after chatting with people for a little while, I asked Phyllis if she could cut me a piece. And then one piece turned into two, and before I knew it, I had about 4 pieces of lemon cake, and then I really regretted it afterwards. And I said, what was Phyllis wearing? She was wearing a turtleneck sweater. It was kind of beige, and I think it was made out of cashmere, and she had jeans on, and she actually looked very pretty. Prettier than I'd seen her in a while. I think she was wearing contacts. And I would just ask about all these details, and then I'd say, well, that's a lot of details for somebody that was unconscious and wasn't there. And the reason that's important is that at any point along that way, there was an opportunity for her to change her mind about going to participate in the party, or going to eat the lemon cake, or to stop eating the lemon cake. Mm-hmm. So I don't believe in the notion of unconscious binging. I believe people believe that. I don't think they're lying or consciously trying to deceive us. But I think that if you step back and you review what happened, you will necessarily take back ownership. The reason that unconscious binging is appealing, where people want to believe it, is that it takes away the feeling of guilt and shame. But you don't want to be frightened of those feelings. It's just like you don't want to be frightened of feeling a little bit of pain if you happen to touch a hot stove, because without feeling that pain, you won't know where the hot stove is. On the other hand, you don't want to get overly involved with it. If you happen to touch a hot stove, you don't put your whole hand down on the stove and say, oh my God, forget it, I'm a pathetic hot stove toucher. I might as well just put my whole hand down and let it burn. You just pay attention, you figure out how you're going to avoid it next time, and then you move on. It turns out that the perseveration on the guilt, because what you're supposed to do is feel guilty for a minute, figure out what went wrong, how do I avoid making this food mistake again in the future, and then let the guilt go. You're not supposed to say, I'm a pathetic overeater and I'm never going to be able to control this, so I might as well just give up and accept being a happy fat person. You're supposed to analyze what went wrong, figure out how you can avoid doing it again. Do you need another rule? Do you need to aim for a different part of the target? And then let it go. Because if you don't, if you allow the pig to keep beating you down, then eventually you're going to feel too weak to resist the next binge. And it turns out that the perseveration on the guilt is actually a form of binge motivation in and of itself. It's just the pig wanting you to feel too weak to resist the next binge. And if you refuse to yell at yourself, it becomes difficult to keep eating more and more and more. And if there's only one thing people took away from this interview, would be to forgive themselves sooner after they made a mistake, to jump in and collect evidence of success. Did you have 5 cupcakes instead of 15? Did you have 5,000 calories instead of 15,000 calories? And collect that evidence of success. Ask, how can I become a better eater, as opposed to why can't I stop eating? Tell yourself that you do have the power of choice. You just made the wrong choice, and move forward. So unconscious guilt, unconscious eating, that whole notion of it eliminates people's sense of guilt and shame, but you don't want to eliminate the guilt and shame. You want to feel it for a minute and then move on.
Well, and I know in your book you talk about that, personal responsibility portion also, and how that plays a part in everything.
Well, what most people's pigs will do is jump from diet to diet. And let's say, oh, this guru's diet is no good. We're going to have to find another one. But in the meantime, we might as well binge our little hearts out until we find the next diet to go on. Yippee, yippee, yippee. Whereas, if you're listening to a call like this and you heard 45 minutes of it, the odds are that you've studied enough diets. The odds are that you have a fairly decent sense of what healthy eating versus unhealthy eating is for you. And if you take responsibility for what your food plan is going to be, and if you take responsibility for following it or not following it, as the case may be, you are much more likely to succeed than if you keep letting your pig fool you into thinking the grass is greener on the other side. You'd be much better off, in my experience. People are better off, even if they pick the wrong diet, sticking to it for a period of time rather than jumping from diet to diet and diet. We call the pig strategy the grass is greener strategy. The grass is greener on the other side, or sometimes we call it the confuse and conquer strategy. But the grass isn't greener on the other side. The grass is greener where it's watered. So, pick a set of rules. Pick just one rule that would make a difference for you and stick to it. Teach yourself how to stick to it. Prove to yourself that you've got the power, and then build from there. Don't even worry about losing weight. Just pick one rule, stick with it for a couple of weeks, and show yourself that you can turn this ship around if you want to.
What an important piece of advice that is. And also, your book, Never Binge Again, has so many tips, advice, just a really good approach on how to, of course, never binge again. And I highly suggest our readers pick up a copy. Where can they connect with you and be part of your community?
Well, everything really starts at neverbingeagain.com. If you go there and click on the big red button, we can get you a free copy of the book in Kindle, Nook, or PDF format. I'm really trying to help as many people as I can. There are also paperbacks and Audible versions. There are charges for those, but the Kindle, Nook, and PDF version are free at neverbingeagain.com. What you'll also get when you do that are a set of recorded coaching sessions for free. I know this is a very strange thing in theory. You must be thinking, why does Marianne have this psychologist with such good credentials on who says he has a pig inside of him? What in the world is going on the show, and has she lost her mind? I know it sounds harsh and weird in the abstract, but if you listen to it being implemented with clients, and you hear how we can turn their sense of despair and powerlessness and sense of defeat into hope and enthusiasm and power in just one session, I know you're going to be really enamored with what we're doing and be motivated to do it for yourself. And then, because I know people struggle with how to formulate the rules and how to put together a whole food plan, we took some time and created some starter templates for any dietary philosophy. So whether you're, ketogenic or macrobiotic or point counter or calorie counter or paleo or low carb or high carb, whatever you're doing, there's a food plan starter template for you. And it's all available at neverbingeagain.com. Click the big red button and sign up for the free reader bonuses.
What if somebody feels like they need a little bit more hands-on? Do you do group coaching?
We do. Oh, yeah. And you'll see exactly where that is. If you want to just go sign up for that right after the this call, you can go to fixyourfoodproblem.com, fix your food problem, and we specialize in helping people fix their food problem fast. But I recommend most people start with the free materials first. We also have a forum, neverbingeagainforum.com, and that's free, where readers interact with each other, and there are a bunch of people who really know what they're doing there. Some people don't, but you'll figure out who the more experienced people are if you hang around there for a little while. And neverbingeagaincoaching.com or fixyourfoodproblem.com will get you the coaching options. And it all starts at neverbingeagain.com with the big red button.
And one last thing before we go, I also know that you have a podcast. I've listened to quite a few of them, and you've got some really great advice. That podcast is Never Binge Again too, right?
neverbingeagainpodcast.com.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So they can sign up for all the great Never Binge Again items, get the book, listen to the podcast, be part of the community, and also get some coaching if that's something that you feel inclined and feel like you need to do. Glenn, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you for having me, Marianne. It's delightful.
Well, thank you, Dr. Glenn. It has been such a pleasure to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your new book, Never Binge Again. What a great resource that is. Again, if you'd like to connect with Dr. Glenn Livingston, you can at his website, neverbingeagain.com, and we'll have the link below. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.